thank you to all of our panelists and everyone who is participating this evening. It's really a delight to be here with all of you. So I want to start, of course, by transporting us back to 1973. I was not around then, but our three panelists were. And I would love for each of you to give us a snapshot of who you were then to help us set the scene. And Larry, we'll start with you.
Sure, I was on the city council. I was elected in a campaign 2 years prior in 71, had just been reelected. And I was also going to law school at night at Suffolk. And I was on the boat in a sleet storm. So I was present. And it was an ugly time in America, not that today is that pretty a time. Richard Nixon was a horrible man. We all knew it, just a question of when we could push him out the door. And that was the setting of I think, the movement, which was around and about us. Young people taking to the streets had effectively slowed down the Vietnam War, maybe not ended it. And now people were looking to get rid of Nixon.
And Aaron, tell us about your positioning at the time.
Well, let's see. I was 25 years old, and I had been working for the city of Boston since, while I even was going to college in 1969. And what happened there is the bicentennial of the country had been planned to be to be like a World's Fair. And that completely went down the tubes. Because all of the different cities were fighting one another of who was going to be designated. So it was decided that the celebration was going to be celebrated all over the country with a special emphasis on the original 13 colonies. And then what happened is that some special consideration was given to the places like Boston, because we were supposed to be the kickoff group. And it was very interesting. So out of the mayor's office of the city, and the mayor at that time was Kevin White, the office of the Boston Bicentennial, otherwise known as Boston 200, began in 1972 to be able, and it was kind of like an outgrowth of Summer Thing, which was a summer arts program. I think that's important for people to know. There was an outgrowth of that with the BRA as the urban planning part of it, and the Office of Economic Development is the third piece of it. So that's the background of the people involved. And the other thing I will say in association with the context of the entire piece is that most of us that were working on this were all in our 20s, and that there was very little differential in philosophy and ideology between the People's Bicentennial and the Boston 200 staff and the people making it happen. So I think that's an important thing to know in terms of everything that happened during that period.
Henry, are you able to hear us, Henry?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So I'll charge in. I was sort of at the end of my counterculture phase. I was making stained glass windows and working as an artist, and was about to go back to graduate school in art history. And of course, I mean, it was a very strange time because it was a period of youth culture, and that had a certain exuberance to it, but also this lingering Vietnam War. And then, of course, it all culminated in Watergate. I mean, Watergate was something that was almost unimaginable at the time. You know, at a time of, well, and I guess my dad was an unusual figure because I guess I'd say that he was an odd mixture of conservative and radical. I think that deep in his heart, he would have loved nothing so much as to go back to the way people lived in the 17th century and, you know, get rid of cars and telephones and all of that kind of thing. And then suddenly he was in partnership with all these radicals and hippies. Someone could write a novel of manners about that. But I give him a lot of credit. I think that, and how would he say? I mean, I think the irony of my father is that his opposition to Nixon in the Vietnam War was in a certain way profoundly conservative. He believed in American values and, in sort of old-fashioned things like integrity and democracy.
Well, Henry, I didn't know your father half as well as you did, but we were on the same campaign trail in '68. And I think he was offended by Richard Nixon, just like many of us are offended by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He was a bore, he was banal, use whatever old-fashioned word you want to use. And I think he thought of Nixon, and that's certainly at that point, everybody else had figured it out, was an embarrassment to the nation, and he had violated the Constitution, and it should be out of there.
Yeah.
So each of you have sort of described a very feverish temperature at that time. It seems like a climate in which people were restless and angry and kind of feeling like they wanted to do something. Did you have a sense that the bicentennial would be, because it was this marked anniversary of our nation, that it would be one of those catalysts for people to release some of that anguish?
From the official side, which was my part, like we would notice that the big difference was that we were, just as we would happen today, you've got the more conservative groups who would want to do the celebration in a particular kind of way. For example, the Tea Party itself had always in the past been sponsored by the disabled war veterans. And they were the group of people that were the most horrified by the idea that the People's Bicentennial was going to be doing something. It was the administration's point of view that, hey, let it all hang out. Let everybody do their thing. And so I think you saw in one of those flyers that the way we handled it was everybody got a time in which they could do their reenactment. So you had the disabled war veterans doing it. The People's Bicentennial was assigned a time. But I must tell you that one of the funnier stories, the only group that sort of didn't follow the rules was the People's Bicentennial. And this was my naivete at age 25, put up all of these huge speaker systems on the buildings all around where the waterfront was, where the People's Bicentennial was, and started talking and singing songs and doing stuff while all these other groups were doing their bicentennial, their reenactment. I don't think I've ever been that naive again, but that was when I learned my lesson along with many others at that time.
Paris, there's a backdrop to all of this. Boston was on its knees financially. All my contemporaries, the guys I grew up with in Dorchester, had come back from Vietnam. They couldn't find work. Inflation was 8, 9, 10%. Unemployment, 8, 9, 10%. Interest rates hadn't gone up yet. And Boston was still finding its way out of the Depression. It was not the world city that Kevin White effectively willed occur. Kevin White willed that we became a world-class city, and we didn't. So it was a very, very different time. And a lot of people were angry for non-ideological reasons, which is sometimes difficult in the world of identity politics to say that, but they were angry because they were out of work. Sometimes they were crashing on their grandmother's couch because they had no place to live. So it was not a good time for Boston, and it didn't get much better because we had the desegregation of the school system the next fall.
Well, and here as a radical, I might speak up, but it seems to me the Vietnam War had a great deal to do with distracting Americans from what they ought to be focusing on, and both financially and just because that took up so much time that people weren't looking at the real problems.
You know,
Go ahead, Heron.
I was also thinking the little things like what about economic development in the city, and it was on its knees. I mean, at that point, it was the very first time that people in city government felt like we could use tourism as an economic development driver. And part of the conflicts that we went through were the old historic groups didn't want any visitors to come in. So that became these conflicts over what you did, how far you publicized anything, what you were actually trying to do with all of these kinds of events that were happening. So it was, but the ideological conflict, I think, was not, well, there certainly was not the kind of hostility that you felt today, that you feel today in any of this.
I definitely want to dig deeper into that. But Heron, tell us more about the organization of the events surrounding the bicentennial. How were they publicized, and how did you get people excited and wanting to participate in this in the midst of everything else that was going on?
Well, in a funny kind of way, when the event was over and we were doing the debrief, one of the things that people said, if it hadn't been for the People's Bicentennial, nobody would have known about this little event. And it was like, and they would not have really been able to make it as big and grand as they had if the city administration hadn't been positive about what they were doing. So that was part of it. But, like one of the big things is we were actually shocked at how many people actually showed up. I mean, that was the part that was really amazing to us because we didn't know. And the other thing was the concept of was to make it, quote, to try to get as many people involved as possible, not just to make it something about just the Revolutionary War, like the very beginning brochure. It was actually made by a firm that's been around for years and years now. Hill Holliday was the ad agency at the time for it, and it was that it was all about everybody's coming to the Boston Tea Party, and it was not just the British are coming, but it's everybody is coming. So that had been the messaging about trying to get people to show up, and also trying to do a lot of different kinds of things that would appeal to a lot of people. And we had a big poster contest, and that all these different people participated in. And there was, again, in that initial slideshow, a group of ad executives from different firms selected it. And I even have here one of the pieces that didn't make it because it didn't carry out our messaging enough. But I thought people would like to see it.
Yeah.
I keep it hanging in my library here. But we decided to make it a weekend. And so there's a whole series of events, and we kicked off actually with Tom Wicker of the New York Times making a speech at Faneuil Hall. And then it went on with several people that I'm sure everyone here recognizes. It was Pauline and remembers Pauline Mayer and Hiller Zobel running a forum the next night at Faneuil Hall that talked about civil liberties, and ending with Ramsey Clark. And this was all the officially sanctioned events, had Ramsey Clark on the final day talking again about the concept of civil liberties. So that was the kind of more the philosophical underpinnings of it. And then we had a ball. We literally had the Tea Party ball that happened at the old Cyclorama building. So it was this range of different kinds of things.
Larry and Henry, as people who weren't on the planning side per se, but were sort of on this participatory, but also somewhat organizationally side, especially Larry with your role in the city, how did you feel like people were ready to mark this? And was that energy even further ignited by everything that was going on?
I think there was nobody who was working at City Hall who didn't know that the Tea Party happened in Boston. And remember, it was the first event of the revolution. And Boston is ahead of Philadelphia and those other places,
Right.
in terms of being in line. And I think we knew that was important, and we had to set the tone for the rest of the nation. And Kevin being Kevin and Kathy Kane being Kathy Kane, there was a lot of intellectual content as well as a lot of theater. And truth be told, as a person who was on a boat being sleeted upon and seeing what I believe were leaves and burlap bags being tossed in the ocean, everything's recyclable. I remember it like it were yesterday, and I had the box of tea that was the party favor. I had that on my credenza at my office until the Tea Party Ship and Museum opened, and I gave it to Sean Ford. And I hope it's over there in a position of honor. And people would see this tea and they'd say, don't tell me that's tea. I know what it is. No. It's not weed. It's tea. It's tea, the same kind of tea that was thrown into the harbor.
Well, one of the things about this event, and surely there were other events that also, but don't you think this changed Boston as a city? It seems to me, if you look back to the early 1960s, Boston was a little bit frozen as a city and actually was notoriously conservative for things like banning books and that kind of thing. I have to say, I find it interesting now. I mean, the idea that a Chinese woman is mayor of Boston, I mean, you had to be Irish Catholic to be.
Oh, yeah.
You couldn't even be Italian.
No, you're absolutely right.
Irish. It was a very rigid city in some ways.
Now, Kevin White deserves the credit for opening up the city. He gave political power to young people, to women.
Yeah.
The beginnings of people of color having a seat at the table. And John Collins may have been a business-like mayor, but there were two colors at City Hall when I was a young man. It was green and gray, and that included the people. Everybody was old, everybody smoked, everybody was white, everybody's related to everybody else. And Kevin changed that. He changed that big time.
Yeah.
I just want to give a reminder to our participants that if you have questions as the panelists are speaking, feel free to drop them in the chat and make sure that you're addressing your questions to everyone. And I'll be sure to pull in questions as they come in. And panelists, if things pop up for you, you can also jump in with those.
That reiterates for me. I've been seeing a lot of stuff about the Freedom Trail. The Freedom Trail did start before the bicentennial, but this was one of the things that pushed it through. And the battles that, and I think made it more successful than it had been before, because the city took on the battles with all of the old guard who didn't want tourists, and said that this is something that's good. This is a good thing. We want visitors to come. And it was because of Kathy Kane and her kind of intellectual heft, along with others at the time, that the whole theme of the whole bicentennial was not just about the Revolutionary War period, but the whole concept, and this both of the other panelists are saying about the change in what was happening of driving Boston to be an international city. The concept was the city is the exhibit. And there were a creation of a whole lot of different trails that went through it. There was a literary trail. There was, for the first time, a Black history trail. There was a woman's trail, and it just went on and on and on, so that there was this concept that we were going to show that our city is the exhibit and we are going to celebrate our city. And this was a different thing, and was also very different from what the other cities had did and planned after. And this was the first event and the kickoff of that.
I was on the council, and each year the Freedom Trail Foundation would appear for an appropriation. And Leverett Saltonstall, who was a US Senator through 1966, appears in front of a committee that I was chairing. I said, Senator Saltonstall, I'm very honored to have you here. And his grandson, Dickie Bird, is a classmate of ours, Henry. And Senator Saltonstall said, well, Mr. Chairman, we are asking for $7,500 for the Freedom Trail. And I said, oh, that seems like a reasonable amount. It says, we have to buy red paint to paint it over. That was the appropriation. So it was a very small time operation, not a lot of marketing back then. And I think Kevin opened the city up.
Well, and of course, that is a result. I mean, I was half aware of this growing up, but Boston was still in New England, and it was in a depression from the collapse of the textile and shoe industry.
Absolutely.
You know, everyone was very accustomed to the idea of being very frugal. You know,
and people of our generation inherited the depression mentality from our parents.
Yeah.
Plain and simple, just the way people lived.
Hmm.
And Boston had never really spent much of anything. We didn't have a lot of money. Now, you know, they have surpluses. Never had surpluses back then.
Yeah.
So if you all could walk us through how did that day unfold in 1973?
Well, it was sleeting. I remember that.
You were
like
on a
yesterday.
boat.
And there was no Gore-Tex or anything like that. So we're all wearing wool coats and getting soaking wet. And we were on a boat. All of the
thing that happened with so there's a Tea Party weekend, all these people are coming, but that day, early in the morning, I show up and I see all these speakers that are set up all around the site where the boat is. And I'm going, oh my God, what is this? And I'm trying to find Jeremy Rifkin, who was the head of the People's Bicentennial, saying, oh, please let all these other groups like the disabled war veterans. And there was also an organization called the Boston Indian Council. That literally was their name, in Boston Indian Council, who had been very upset about, in the past, the disabled war veterans wearing, quote, war paint and big feathered, absolutely every stereotypical thing that you possibly could do. And they came to the city and they said, please do not let this happen again. And that became the major bone of contention between the disabled war veterans and what they wanted to do at their reenactment, and what we were trying to do with trying to make this something that everybody would be participate in and feel happy about. I think I spent more time on that particular issue than I did with anything else. But everybody got assigned a time but what also happened is we never dreamed that many people would show up. And the VIPs were on this boat, and there were so many people standing on the Northern Avenue Bridge that they couldn't get the bridge up. So the boat couldn't get through to see with the VIPs. Then that's where Larry was, to see what would happen. Total disaster. And I look back at it now and I laugh. At the time, I was like, I wanted to cry. But it was a very interesting.
Well, the other thing that younger people may not understand, at this point, we are less than 30 years from the end of World War II. Right. So the men, it's mostly men, 16 million who fought in that war, were in their prime. They're all 50 years old, maybe some were 60. And the veterans groups were very big. and very powerful.
Mhm.
And they controlled a lot of the agendas. They controlled the parades, and you didn't want to cross those guys. And there were 4 competing veterans groups, which also would be competing among each other, which made things even more complicated.
And the other thing I think that so you had the veterans groups, you also had the Sierra Club that wanted to do a reenactment. So we let the Sierra Club, like, you get a time, go do it. And there were just, there was just all of these different groups trying to make the day. And as I think I repeat what I said before, if it hadn't been for the controversy around it, I don't think it would have gotten the amount of publicity nationally and internationally that it got. But was, in a funny kind of way, a wonderful way to kick off the spirit of the bicentennial in the city. The other little quick thing that is interesting is that at the time, the only thing the city used to fund kind of before this was more parades. There was a fund for parades, but they had never funded before this just major events like this. And this was a change. And this was, and I think my boss, Kathy, was the one that, working with the mayor, managed to say, we really need to do this for a whole lot of reasons.
As Henry suggested, the council was mostly old Irish guys, one of whom, a guy named Gabriel Neal, probably was stuck in the 18th century, and horrible man. And he was against everything. Anything which was new, he was against it. And he put up a fight in a bunch of these things. We found the votes and we got it passed. And he would ask horrible, rude questions. But he's dead now, so we can talk.
Rest his soul.
Well, I mean, it is interesting to think about, because I guess I'd say that I'm sure that there must have been a large group of people who were expecting the bicentennial to be a sort of bunch of parades of people in colonial uniform. And those events all seem to kind of fizzle. And, of course, Nixon, with Watergate and so forth, gave a very peculiar quality to that year, which was supposed to be a celebratory year. But anyway, I mean, I think that this event really, I mean, should we call it the Woodstock of patriotic celebrations? It sort of set a new pattern. And I guess first, the irony is that it went back to something closer to the feeling of the original Boston Tea Party, which wasn't exactly a polite event.
And how did it get to, I mean, what was the turning point in the day where you started to realize that, oh, this has become something different? And what was the nature of that turn?
I was working on so I don't think it hit me until after I read all the TV, after I saw all the international coverage of the event.
And what were you seeing here? And like, what were the headlines?
About first battle of the bicentennial would be a headline. Nixon goes down at the Tea Party. You would see that kind of thing in international news. And there wasn't any, there wasn't social media at that time. So we had to wait to see what all the coverage was. But it was, I don't think if you were there that it didn't hit you. I don't know, Henry, what do you think? Do you think were you aware that this was a change in how things were going to be done?
I think I was aware of it. I mean, frankly, there was so much else going on at the time. And sometimes it's only in retrospect that, I mean, you can almost be at an event and not quite realize what's happening until later.
Right.
Again, difficult as it is for younger people to understand it. Probably Aaron, me and you saw what was on the 11 o'clock news. 4, 5, and 7, we had 3 channels. Then waited for the Globe the next day. And the Herald was less important, but still an important newspaper. And you just saw, and I think the world figured out that it was not going to be as the original old white guys planned it. It was not going to be a whole bunch of people in colonial dress or people reenacting Thanksgiving with turkeys or whatever they do down there in Plymouth. And you know, we were there first. President Ford came here in 75, went to Old North Church. He said, one if by day and two if by night, I recall. I think he was incorrect in this history. It was a big thing. It's a very big thing. You know, the President of the United States come to a city for a historic event. But then the rest of the world, you know, we had Lexington and Concord, which Boston was not responsible for, had reenactments out there. Lexington Green is a big piece of real estate, so you can have a lot of people there. The Old North Bridge, a little tougher, not as much land for people to gather around. And then it was off to Philadelphia and the rest of those places.
And how did, I mean, were there reverberations in Philly or had things sort of calmed down by then?
Okay,
I
we were
wasn't
always
there.
fighting. We were always fighting them for money, for grants from the government for these events. I mean, that was the big, and it was, you know, it was about the proposal writing and who was going to have the best proposal and try. And the guy who ran the Bicentennial Commission was Senator Warner.
Warner,
He was not a senator at that point, but he was the person that was running the Bicentennial Commission. This was before Elizabeth Taylor, too, I think.
Right.
Yeah, it was right. You know, because afterwards he married.
He had been Secretary of the Navy,
and then
looked like a movie star.
Yeah,
had some family money, ran the Bicentennial, married Elizabeth Taylor, ended up in the U.S. Senate. Didn't have a bad record.
Sounds like a full life, yeah.
But he was the one that we would have to go bow to get extra money. And, you know, it used to be kind of funny. It was just, well, it wasn't funny. It was just hard work. And I think Boston had the only organization that was kind of city funded, that was a public-private partnership, as opposed to just a commission or something like that. It was really a public-private partnership. And we were part of the mayor's office, which gave us a lot more clout in a funny way in getting things done. And Kathy was a brilliant fundraiser. And she was able to get money from corporations, which the People's Bicentennial just crucified me over. I mean, that was the issue that I'd have to be on a radio show with Jeremy Rifkin. And I mean, he is brilliant. He's absolutely fantastic. And I would be like, no, I don't think I was that bad, but and I remember one lady calling into the radio station saying, well, I don't see any difference between the two of them. and my going, part of it was that I was not able to go, to hit back at Jeremy, because and then they would put these flyers out about how the Boston Bicentennial was controlled by all the event planners and choreographers, and as opposed to, having the content of, we were going to go out there and, do whatever we had to do as the men of the revolution had done. So that was but I just blame it on my age as opposed to anything else.
I just want to note a couple comments that are coming through the chat. Judith, let me see if I can scroll back to see it. Judith commented and said that Judith was on the bridge watching the events and overheard a reenactor who was part of the greatest generation acknowledge that the People's Bicentennial Protest was to a modern audience a reminder of what the destruction of the tea meant to history.
That's great.
Yeah, that is a very significant statement there, Judith. Colleen is commenting saying, I do recall a reenactment in Charlestown, which was a big event.
Bunker Hill.
Yes,
Bunker Hill was big.
right. It doesn't, and Colleen saying it doesn't sound like the committee planned that. Was there another group for Charlestown who also planned events, or was
Yes.
different things were going on?
There was a Charlestown Historical Society, which planned this event. And that was very interesting because Charlestown was becoming, and Larry, you please pop in on this one because you can do it more than I. Charlestown was becoming gentrified. And it wasn't conflict, but the tension.
Competing groups. The Historical Society was the old timers, and the Preservation Society were the people that Karen and Henry and I went to school with. And there's a fellow named Conway who was a clerk of courts in the Charlestown court, and it was active in the Legion post, Bunker Hill post number 27. And I think he was involved with the reenactment. I assume I was there in June. And because that Bunker Hill Day is the 17th of June. We used to have it as a holiday, not anymore. So Conway was involved, and there's another group called the Bunker Hill Monument Association.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all of these groups that in some cases are not incorporated, don't have budgets, don't have dues, but they just exist. Another one in Charlestown is the Charlestown Schoolboys Association. If you're a person who was a student and grew up in Charlestown, you can join, whatever that means. So there's a lot of different competing groups.
I just had a thought that may relate to a lot of this, is that the American Revolution gives rise to different groups wanting to take on the names of what is going on in honor, and it can represent a whole variety of ideologies. Like, I think at the time when, after a couple of years later, when remember that the busing actual ruling came down in 73, but the implementation wasn't until 75, or is that
fall of 74? Fall of
okay,
74.
74. So you're beginning to have these different groups all around the city that were starting to use the vernacular of the American Revolution to support their positions. And that just grew over time.
I might say that in one way, the significance of this event, I think that we're all very affected by our view of history, and that becomes a kind of moral justification for the way we deal with the present. And this is an event that brought out the fact that the American Revolution was revolutionary, and that it did have an edge. And it does seem to me that this is a point where Boston and Massachusetts more largely was shifting from a city that had very definite ethnic neighborhoods with walls around them to something that was starting to open up a little bit.
Henry,
You're absolutely correct, Ken. Absolutely correct. I wrote a book, talks about it, when all the people who were against busing moved out, a whole bunch of younger educated people moved in. And we bottomed out at 534,000 people at one point. Now we're back to about 700. So dramatic changes. You're absolutely correct. And the interesting, of all the anti-busing groups, none of which like me, but that's a whole other discussion. The group in Charlestown was called Powder Keg. Mm-hmm. And they had a logo that had like dynamite, I don't know what a powder keg is. But the whole idea was it'll all blow up. And there were serious concerns that, speaking of revolutionary things, that people in East Boston would be so upset about deseg, they'd blow up the tunnel.
Mm.
And they probably were capable of blowing up the tunnel. Maybe not completely, but making life difficult, which is why that there was no buses sent to East Boston and no children from East Boston put on a bus for a while. But yeah, Charlestown group was the powder keg, and they would alternatively kneel down, say prayers, then yell and scream and use the N word. Very, very interesting.
So this is and Larry, Ron is giving you a nod saying that he recalls you being the only smart non-cloud member of the Boston City Council during the busing crisis. So kudos to you. But what you all were saying is a great segue into the future, right? Into next year and the 250th anniversary, because we're at a time where we have a lot of different groups of people essentially interpreting our history in different ways, in ways that are coinciding, but also very starkly conflicting with each other. So how do we loop all of those people in together? I mean, I know we were talking earlier about how, Native Americans were kind of grossly represented and misrepresented during the bicentennial, and how we have, we're at the point now where we do land acknowledgements at the beginning, right, of events like this. And so we're in the middle of this reckoning. Obviously, we are about 2 years out from our latest iteration and our kind of recognition of racial inequity in America. So and of course, we had the insurrection on January 6th. I almost forgot to include that, right? So how do we bring all these things together when we're talking about a really pivotal moment in our nation's birth history that was also a moment of protest?
Well, yeah, I might just throw it there. And I mean, after living through the 60s, I thought I'd never see anything quite so crazy again, but we seem to be in a pretty crazy period. But I'm sort of a pessimistic optimist, because I think a lot of the time these very reactionary things are sort of like the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, where the Nazis are losing everything and they're going to give it one last try and put everything they can into it. And I actually do think that we're in a sort of transformative moment of American society. I mean, there are things, how would I say, when you gain something, you always lose something. There's something, I grew up in a little New England town where, literally some of the people bought their land from the Indians in the 1600s, and we're still farming that same land. And there's something wonderful about a very traditional society like that, and you lose something when times change. I think that we're going to see, there are going to be a lot of bumps, but that, this is going to be another progressive period. And one of the things that's interesting is that we are starting to look at American history differently.
Personally, I think that the upcoming events give us an opportunity to say the story of America is a never-ending story. It hasn't just frozen in time. It's going to keep going. And if that is the messaging, and if we can all accept that that is the messaging, it means not just that the 13 colonies will play a role in this, but that the whole country can play a role, that we are a never-ending story. And I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think that may be the way to look at it when we're going forward on these.
All of us also have to encourage schools and the rest of society as being a marketplace of ideas. We should be vigilant against, like that minister in Tennessee burning books. I think he burned Harry Potter and Twilight. That's the books that taught my children how to read. And good Lord knows what else he threw in there. So we really have to remember that the spirit of America is that there's a free marketplace of ideas. That's why a whole bunch of people came here in the first place, because they didn't have it back where they were living. And not only the originals, but a whole bunch of immigrants, Germans in 48, all sorts of groups came here because they could have a free marketplace, and books would not be banned or burned.
I know we're running out of time, but I want to ask this final question because it relates to what you're saying, Larry. This question from Michael Rafferty, who's asking if we should expect controversy over how American history is taught in schools, in high school particularly. And I'm going to go even further with that and, ask, are we going to have to start re-examining the way that we teach, the history around the bicentennial, around the Boston Tea Party, and other events of our nation's birth?
I haven't read a high school history book in a while. One of my daughters is a teacher, but it's elementary level. I expect that the books should read differently than they did when I went to school. And it was pretty basic, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys kind of stuff. There wasn't a lot of understanding as what the underlying issues were. There was certainly no reference to cultural appropriation because the patriots, and we call them patriots, means different things to different people, dressed up like Indians so they could hide. They did that so they wouldn't be caught. So I think it should be taught very differently. And if somebody wants to hire Professor Adams and I, we can probably do some writing of a history book and straighten things out.
Yeah.
And then Heron can help you, Mark.
But I guess what I would say is I think that one of the things, and you see this on the part of both left and right, the idea that there's one way to teach things. And I think with almost any issue, if you get into it seriously, you see that there are different points of view. And also, I mean, one of the challenges is it's easy for us to apply the values of today to past periods, but they were dealing with a different social construct and a different economic construct. And it seems to me there's a constant evolution there.
Great. Well, I'm sorry to pop in to say that we've reached the end of our time here today. I feel like I would love to spend another several more hours with this crew.
I know. Same here, Anne.
It's been a fantastic evening. So thank you so much to Paris, Henry, Larry, Heron for this conversation. And if you're not already, we encourage you to make sure you're following Rev Spaces on social media and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on these and other programmings that'll be coming up. Thank you all so much. And I hope to see you back here or at Old South soon.